Oh my god, it's finally here. Star Wars The Force Awakens, the much anticipated sequel to the classic pop cultural sensation Star Wars. Wow, this is a big one. This is a big one. I don't normally do modern film reviews. Generally, living in Australia means that we get films a lot later than you guys in the US. This is not the case. We actually got it earlier than you guys, funnily enough. I saw it today. I literally just got back from it, and oh my god, what did I think of it? Well, first of all, this entire review is going to be very, very, very spoiler-filled. It's very difficult to talk about why this film is good, which I would say it is, and why some of the elements are weaker without spoiling it. So first and foremost, if you don't want to be spoiled, please leave, but note that I would recommend seeing this film. We are now in spoiler territory. Don't say I didn't warn you. Essentially, this film is a copy of A New Hope in almost beat for beat, and sometimes even shot for shot in some places. That's not to say the film is bad because of that, but it is very, very much A New Hope. And the reason for that would obviously be that Disney wants to play it safe, and hopefully the sequels after this, hopefully 8 and 9, are more so their own films rather than just copying Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Does that make the film good or bad? Well, it's a bit difficult to judge from that perspective. Yes, copying things is not very good, but it's done in such a way that it isn't a direct copy. I mean, the story beats are, point for point in places, and I'll kind of go into that. And you'll know what I mean if you've seen the film. Notably, the cinematography in this film is actually really decent. Not very Star Wars-y in parts. In some places it is, obviously, because you have the same setting, but about a third of the film kind of looks like a Star Wars film in terms of a lot of the SFX shots, and a lot of the shots of the ships are very, very Star Wars-esque. Then about another third, all of which are generally like extreme long shots of settings, look amazing, and they look like shots kind of taken out of storyboards, like lifted directly from a storyboard. They kind of look like art pieces, essentially, because it will generally have small character in one place and gigantic setting for the rest of it. There's a few shots like that in the trailer, which was actually what initially drew me to the film, as I was thinking, wow, that actually looks pretty decent, good cinematography. And then the other third, generally out of notable shots, is this weird kind of semi-handheld cam that often goes into Dutch angles, and Dutch angles are where the camera goes on the side and you see things from diagonal, and they feel really out of place in some places. Overall, though, it's not enough to really detract from the film, but yeah, the cinematography, a really, really standout element of this film. So what's the plot, you may be asking? I went into cinematography a little bit early. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's very, very similar to A New Hope. You have the essential droid is carrying a vital piece of information, the Resistance and the Empire are looking for it. You have very, very similar character arcs and story beats with Obi-Wan dying, Han Solo dying, which I think if you know about Star Wars, then that was pretty much expected to happen. If you don't know, Harrison Ford wanted Han Solo to be killed off at the end of Empire Strikes Back because he thought that was a ripe time for the character to die, but then executives wanted to bring him back for Return of the Jedi because he was too iconic, and then he just doesn't do anything in that film, and the film isn't amazing. It's definitely the weakest of the trilogy. And I think the question I actually asked myself legitimately when I came out of the theater was, is The Force Awakens a better film than Return of the Jedi? And I think that's actually a very serious question to ask, because as a whole film, I think The Force Awakens is a little bit better. Individual elements in Return of the Jedi are fantastic, but as a whole piece, it's kind of weighed down by the whole Ewok sequence and the second Death Star, and that is kind of ironic saying that because, of course, The Force Awakens has the third Death Star, or the Starkiller Base, or whatever it's called. On that note, if I use any wrong terminology for Star Wars, please do not hound me. I am simply a poor beggar. And that actually should be noted, my level of Star Wars fanaticism. Not fanatic, I very, very much enjoy the original trilogy. I think it's a fantastic set of films, particularly The Empire Strikes Back. Great sequel. Probably the best sequel ever made? Maybe? Yeah, I think I'd stick by that. The Raid 2 comes close. Aliens, Terminator 2, very good films. And it's funny I mentioned The Raid, actually, because two guys from The Raid show up in one scene as like a cameo. I just thought I'd mention that. Probably no one's seen The Raid 2. A fantastic film, by the way. You should probably check that out. Oh my god, I'm so all over the place. Okay, so what is good and what is bad about this film? Okay, so to do that, I'm just going to go through a lot of the film kind of plot-wise. Notably, starting out, the film is very, very solid. Immediately reminiscent of A New Hope. The first shot in The Force Awakens is a Star Destroyer covering a planet's light with its shadow, which is, of course, very, very reminiscent of the opening shot of A New Hope, which is the Rebel ship being chased by a Star Destroyer as well. So immediate parallels, and I guess that's something to note, is that Star Wars has always had this element of poetry or pottery where a lot of the films rhyme, as George Lucas likes to call it, particularly with the prequels, which are horrible, horrible films, terrible, terrible pieces of God, anything. They really, really should be destroyed. The world would be a far better place without them. But regardless, those films essentially were copies in elements of the original trilogy, but not beat for beat story-wise. They're very, very different story-wise, but they had elements and shots that were exactly the same, like Luke loses his hand, Anakin loses his hand, like that sort of stuff. The good thing about this is that The Force Awakens copies a lot of elements of A New Hope. Like, when I say copy, I mean, essentially just directly copies, like blowing up the Death Star, blowing up the Starkiller base. One pilot targets a small, weak area in it to blow up something big. Exactly the same thing happens. There's even a very, very similar shot of the Millennium Falcon flying away from the exploding base. The Force Awakens actually seems to know how Star Wars worked, while the prequels seem to be like aliens came down to Earth and chemically created a film. I say film very, very loosely because I wouldn't even consider the prequels films. They're just abominations. Essentially, the beginning of this film to about 40 minutes is very, very solid, really, really wonderful visual storytelling and particularly editing. There's a few really interesting shots where you'll go from Oscar Isaac's character Poe Dameron and it will cut to a shot of Finn, the stormtrooper, and it'll cut to a shot of him and then swap to his perspective and start kind of following him. So a lot of the editing and camera work was extremely fluid. Like, that's the thing that immediately came to mind. And especially that fitting in with the pacing. The pacing of this film is rapid fire, but not in a way that's often a negative, except when you get to Han Solo's death, which I'll kind of talk about a bit later. The pacing never feels rushed in this first segment. It does feel very, very jumpy in places, but it's not really a bother. It's actually just really very smooth, kind of transitioning between characters, Poe to Finn to BB-8 to Rey, back to the Empire or the First Order or whatever. I'm just going to call them the Empire. They're the Empire. It's the same fucking thing. Yeah, this first segment is really pretty fantastic. I love the use of practical effects in this film. I think that was kind of a selling point in a lot of the advertising to fans of Star Wars to essentially say, we're not doing the prequels. Yes, it's going to have good CGI in it, but we're doing practical effects. Real things are happening here. It isn't just all on a green screen, and it's handled very, very well for the most part. The set design in this film is brilliant. It's really, really great, and a lot of the props, fantastic. Excellent. And when they do use CGI, which they do a lot of, it's very, very high quality, photorealistic, and I think we've kind of reached that stage in CGI production where it's often just flawless at this point. I think there was maybe like 1 or 2 shots where things looked a little bit dodgy. One of them was where like a wall was exploding and you could kind of see that it was 3D rendered. And another one was where Han Solo was walking with Finn along an ice planet, along the Starkiller base planet, and that shot looked a bit green screened, but I mean, that's pretty much it. The rest of it was essentially flawless in terms of CGI and visual/practical effects. On top of that, a lot of the costumes for the monsters are great. Really, really great practical effects. Like, fantastic. Great return to that. Even though a lot of the film does copy old Star Wars imagery, obviously you're going to have to do some of it because it's set in the same universe and it's a sequel. But I mean, I'm talking about like specific visuals, and it should be noted that this film isn't as horrendous as I thought it would be, or as forced as I thought it would be with old trilogy references. There are definitely references to the old trilogy that are forced, and I'll go into those right about now. But first, they're not as bad as they could be. The entire film isn't, hey, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, if you've seen the original trilogy. It's like, we're going to take the story of A New Hope and elements of Return of the Jedi and elements of even like Revenge of the Sith in parts, and we're going to kind of make our own thing with it. And on top of that, then there are a few, maybe like 3 or 4 very direct and very awkward references to the original trilogy. One of them is where Finn is searching through parts of the Millennium Falcon and he picks up the like droid ball that Luke uses to train with. You know, he's got the blaster shield down and it's shooting lasers at him, and he picks it up and just holds it in camera like this and looks down at it, you know, for a solid second, and then throws it away. And it's not so much of like he's going through the trash, he's quickly doing it, and it's like, you know, fans would catch that in like, you know, the DVD copy and they'd slow down the frames and go, oh my god, he's got this, oh my god. It's very like, hey, do you remember this from the original trilogy? This happened in the original trilogy. Do you remember it? This thing happened. Do you remember that? That was fun, wasn't it? And it's pretty bad. Like that was easily one of the cringe moments of the film. There's another one where Finn accidentally turns on the holographic chess table, and it's not so much like he accidentally does it yet again, it's he turns it on and then it's like the film stops to acknowledge that this happened in the original trilogy. Like, do you remember it? Do you remember the original trilogy? Luckily, there aren't any other super heinous references, which I was really glad of. I mean, these come in the middle of the film, so it wasn't like right at the beginning, so I was feeling a sense of dread, like, oh my god, the rest of the film is going to be totally like this. It was mainly just those, because they're on the Falcon, and the Falcon obviously is so iconic. There was a lot more they could have done with that to make that worse. The whole film could have been, word for word quotes from the original film. But anyway, I say the first 40 minutes is good, and that's because essentially the whole thing takes place on Jakku with Rey, the Luke Skywalker character, essentially. It isn't directly stated, but it's heavily implied that she's Luke's daughter, and I think I'm safe in saying that. Besides her acting, the actor's name is Ridley something. I should probably do research for this, but I wanted to get this down immediately on my brain. Her acting is really bad, at least in the beginning parts. She's monologuing to BB-8, and also some of her dialogue is really forced, but this is probably the worst in terms of acting and dialogue in the film, this part. And ironically, it's contrasted with the best in cinematography and visuals in terms of like visual storytelling, which is ironic because her acting when talking to BB-8, she finds BB-8 in the desert, and she's talking to it like a companion because she can understand the droid speak. Her acting is like next level bad. It's completely monotone and expressionless, and it's like she's just reading lines from an autoprompter. It's actually shocking that they got that bad a take and ran with it, because her acting in the rest of the film isn't amazing. Like it's definitely the weakest out of everyone. Maybe Carrie Fisher also is not very good. Everyone else, by the way, is actually really good. Finn is actually really, really, really good. Oscar Isaac is fantastic with the little screen time he has. Harrison Ford actually surprisingly puts in a good performance. If you followed his career for the past 20 years, especially Indiana Jones, which obviously is a sequel that everyone hated and no one wanted, his acting in that is terrible, terrible. But he actually seems to care for this, maybe because he knew he was going to get killed off and he really wanted to just die. But yeah, he actually puts in a pretty good performance here. But Rey, the actor for Rey, man, in this beginning part, she's really pretty bad. I was actually kind of shocked. And this is after, Finn and Poe have been introduced, and their acting is decent, decent to good to interesting. Finn's actually quite a good comic relief. He has some really good comedic timing in parts. Not all of his jokes ran extremely well, but most of them were well delivered, even if I didn't find them absolutely hilarious. They were solid. They weren't cringe-inducing. They weren't bad by any means, which is a good thing. But yeah, Rey, not a very good actor in the beginning, pretty awkward throughout the film, but she definitely does get better. This is definitely the low point, and it was kind of worrying because, she's essentially the main character, so you don't really want your main character to have terrible acting throughout the film. And acting is not something I always like to focus on in terms of criticism, because it's not really a part of the story or the mythos or the technical aspect. It's kind of like you have the players of the film, and they're not the most important as to what their acting is like, but if it's bad enough, it's going to detract from your experience, and it did detract a little bit. The exposition in this scene, and a lot of this film was exposition, awkward exposition, where it's kind of blurted out and very wordy, like like she's talking to this robot, and they need to establish that she hasn't seen her family in ages and she was abandoned as a child, so she goes, "No, I don't have a family either. I wonder if they're ever going to come back." And it's like, come on, you don't need to do that. On top of that, the actual visual storytelling of her life is fucking fantastic. This whole segment about her selling scrap is fantastic because A, it sets up her character as kind of a poor, scrap-getting, extremely minimum wage, unhappy person who gets these horrible sachets of food that sponge up into bread, which I actually thought was a really, really cool scene and a really neat idea. Very, very Star Wars-y, and something that was very original to the film. Obviously, it wasn't in the other Star Wars films, so nice to see that they're actually doing something new and not just copying every single element of A New Hope. Have you seen A New Hope? Please tell me. But yeah, this whole scene is great. She's living on her own in the wreckage of an AT-AT, which is pretty cool. I like that, which is pretty nice. That's really neat. But her being a scrap collector also serves the dual purpose of her being fantastic with ships and mechanics, which comes back into play later in the film. And that's something to note. This script is really, really tight. That's a good thing in some ways. There's probably one scene which is a bit superfluous. It's where the Millennium Falcon gets taken in by these pirates or something, and Han is storing aliens on his ship. It just gets a little bit weird, and that scene didn't really serve a purpose after it. The only point of the scene was that the Empire finds out that the main characters have a map to Luke Skywalker's location because he disappeared. But they could have easily discovered this in another way that didn't take 10 minutes. Regardless, I mean, the scene's interesting enough, but just in terms of like story writing, that's the only scene that felt superfluous. I mean, that's not to say the pacing is perfect. Like I was saying, the pacing is very, very quick and very, very smooth for the most part, in the beginning at least, because it's very visual. And of course, the score by John Williams, which actually wasn't amazing. Nothing really stood out. The only piece that really stood out in the film was the scene in which 5 different planets are destroyed by the Starkiller base, because, you know, we're not just destroying one Alderaan, we're destroying 5, because, you know, it's the Death Star, but it's bigger and badder. Oh my god, you know, it has to be even more powerful. You have to top A New Hope. And it's funny because they actually go out of their way to go, this is the Death Star. The Starkiller base, I mean, it looks like a Death Star, but it isn't, even though obviously they're just copying A New Hope. So they kind of, funnily enough, go out of their way to kind of try and make it not be a Death Star, even though it does exactly the same thing, just on a bigger scale, and it's a planet. But anyway, yeah, the visual storytelling in the first section, fantastic. But then the film starts to slow down a bit. There's a whole section where, after all the characters escape off Jakku, that's like Han Solo, Chewie, and then the rest of the main cast, Finn and Rey, they go to like a bounty hunter sanctuary, which kind of reflects the bar scene in A New Hope, very much so, like the atmosphere of, there's no cutting off hands, there's none of that, but the atmosphere is definitely the same, you know, a bunch of weird alien characters doing things, and the film kind of slows down here. In terms of plot arcs, it's almost like the third act happens in the second act. And by third act in a film, I mean the characters are at their lowest point. So essentially, maybe the main character has been defeated, someone's injured, something wrong has happened, and that's at the beginning of the third act. So essentially, it should be going first act, second act, and then you crash at the beginning of the third act. The hero is at his lowest point, and then at the end of the third act, they rise again and they triumph over evil. But essentially for this, it kind of goes like that, and then that. So they kind of crash in the middle of the film. Finn decides to run away because he's too scared. Rey has to go back to Jakku because her family apparently is going to come back, but that isn't really explained very well, and it is like, oh, okay, I guess they're at their lowest point now. And I was kind of expecting that to happen again when Rey gets captured later and she's on the Death Star, but that doesn't really happen. It kind of happens with Han's death, but the weird thing is that the pacing's so fast that there's never really enough time spent actually taking the gravity of his death. It's actually a good thing because obviously in A New Hope, Obi-Wan Kenobi dying is replicating Han Solo dying. They die from, you know, Darth Vader, Kylo Ren. There's obviously parallels between those two, especially with Kylo Ren trying to be like Vader or being like a disciple of Vader and asking his burnt helmet questions and guidance. My main problem with that was that there's not really enough of a lull into depression and weakness of the main characters, whereas in A New Hope, Obi-Wan Kenobi dying was the beginning of the third act before they triumph and destroy the Death Star. With Han dying, it's like, as much as I like it in terms of a plot element because it very much mirrors Luke losing a father figure, Rey loses a father figure that she never had, and that's not necessarily a good thing that it's just copying A New Hope, it just works in terms of storytelling, and that's also why they're doing it again, because A, it worked, and B, it's from Star Wars, and hey, have you seen A New Hope? They don't really spend enough time taking in the gravity of the situation because it's very much a like, we have to go, we're on a clock situation, and they just kind of go, oh, he dies, and then Leia goes, oh no, I'm sad, and Rey yells no, and then they just kind of go off, and then they're a little bit sad about it later, and that's about it. And then you don't really get the gravity of his death. And there should have been more gravitas towards it because his character actually plays a pretty important part in this film. It isn't just, hey, do you remember Han Solo from A New Hope? He's like a pop culture figure, and that's why his death is important. No, his death actually is important in terms of the plot of the film. Like, that's the main problem with the prequels, is that Anakin has this incredibly important backstory. He's like the chosen one, but that's only because Darth Vader is important to us. Like, pop culturally, he's a very, very famous figure. But, you know, just in the prequel films, he gets treated like shit by Tarkin. He's like an underling. He's like the Empress bitch, essentially. You know, it doesn't really make sense for him to be the most important person who'll bring balance to the Force, that sort of thing. So that kind of sucks. But in this case, Han Solo is actually an important character in the film, and really they should have spent more time on his death. I have no problem with him dying. I think it's fantastic. I think that was one of the things I was worried about coming into this and hearing about the original cast coming back, is they're all going to be old and they're all going to be bored, and Harrison Ford is going to put an Indiana Jones performance in. But he doesn't. He's really fun, and his character is pretty decent. Well, I've pretty much given this film amazing praise, except for kind of criticizing the pacing a little bit, but I think we'll go into some of the negatives of the film now. So for one, there are a few moments, mainly to do with acting and mainly to do with writing, that are really, really awkward and kind of out of place. And they really don't work, don't feel very Star Warsy, and just kind of don't work in the film at all. First and foremost, there are just a few lines here and there, especially with the acting and chemistry between Finn and Rey, that don't really work. Most of the time their chemistry is decent, even though the chemistry between Finn and Poe is actually a lot better, though they don't really have enough screen time together. But there are just a few lines here and there that are a little bit awkward. I can't remember anything out of my brain because they were very, very quick and they were just kind of like, what? Moments, and then the film just kind of keeps on going at its rapid pace, and I'm like, oh, gotta look at new things. On top of that, there's one main scene that stuck out to me with Finn in the bounty hunter area. This is before he tries to go and run off to another planet because he's scared of the First Order and he doesn't want to fight and he's a coward. And then, of course, his character arc is that he turns that around to save Rey and then he becomes a hero, etc., etc. But there's one scene where he essentially just monologues to Rey how great she is and how she's the best person he's met, but they didn't really need that. They could have told that visually, on top of the fact that the audience really already knows that about him and it's already been kind of heavily implied visually, so that felt really out of place. Like, it was kind of like the writer wrote that but didn't understand that the audience already kind of understood it. On top of that, the actual Han Solo death scene when he's talking to Kylo Ren has some really, really edgy, bad dialogue from Kylo Ren, and I'd like to say that Kylo Ren's character is actually pretty interesting. It's nice to have a disgusting, angry personality. His character reminded me a lot of Zuko from Avatar The Last Airbender, which is funny because Avatar The Last Airbender copies a lot from the original trilogy of Star Wars, but Zuko and Kylo are very kind of angry and short and kind of petulant, but at the same time they're very, very powerful people, so they just kind of throw their power around. On top of that, they're both complete edgelords, and that's pretty much what Kylo's like. The actual act of the death scene where it's like Kylo's kind of pretending to go back to Han and then he turns the lightsaber around and stabs him through the stomach, which is great. I kind of like that thing generally. It is very overdone to have that kind of 180 for the villain, but it kind of works here because it's unexpected enough to actually kill off Han. But I very much did see it coming. Even just hearing about a new Star Wars film that has the old cast in it, I immediately go, okay, Han Solo's gonna die. That's like the token character, you gotta kill him off. I don't know if they're ever gonna kill off Luke. I'm about 50-50 if they will. I mean, he's essentially the Yoda character at this point, very much so, because it's all poetry, like it rhymes, and he's gonna be the Yoda character for Rey, and Yoda, of course, dies, but not from battle, from like old age, because he's 900 something, but Luke is only like 70 something, canonically, like Mark Hamill's maybe not even 70, like 60 something. So I don't know how that's gonna work, but regardless, the actual death scene is a little bit awkward. It's nicely shot in parts, and there's a very clever, but at the same time, kind of cringy and simplistic thing where the Starkiller base is harnessing the sun for energy, which is really campy and really stupid, but I kind of like it because it's so stupid. Like, it's literally sucking fire from the sun, which is just like, that's, I laughed heartily at that visual because it's just completely ridiculous. But whatever, it's like, who gives a shit? It's a, campy sci-fi film. But, and I don't normally say that for most films, but it's kind of, the rest of it is kind of campy enough that it's okay. And I mean, obviously I'm not a huge fan of it and I think it's kind of stupid, but the rest of it's kind of played camp and simple, so it's not the worst. If it was a super duper serious, hyper realistic, gritty film in space that just did that, then I would obviously be like, that is totally the wrong move to do. Regardless, as the sun's light goes out and it goes to dark, the whole planet goes to dark, Kylo reveals that he's evil and kills Han. So that was actually like a nice universal realization of this event is happening in the plot. Let's tie that in with a scene happening with two characters. And that's what I mean by fluidity in the script, where it's like things serve multiple purposes in ways you don't expect, and it's very fluid in swapping between perspectives and understanding where things are coming from in that regard. And that was really pretty nice, even if it was like the light has gone out and it's literally gone to dark, so he's literally gone to the dark side. Like, yeah, but, whatever. Probably should mention some of the campy stuff. It is kind of cringy in parts with some of the campy stuff, but overall it's not like the worst. That's kind of relating back to what I was talking about with some of the moments are a bit like, no, they shouldn't be in the film. A really interesting one, I was talking about Kylo Ren kind of being like Zuko, being really petulant. There's a kind of recurring joke about him throwing tantrums and pulling his lightsaber out and just slashing a bunch of like control panels and things around a room. I think the first one is because he finds out that his minions have not found the piece of the map to Luke, and he just pulls out his lightsaber and just cuts a bunch of things up, and people are like, looking at each other, kind of scared. The second one is where Rey begins to use the Force and she escapes this area, and he kind of comes in to interrogate her more, and she's gone. And this is like a serious moment. It's kind of like a mystical learning moment. She understands what the Force is. She tricks a stormtrooper, which is actually quite a well done and funny scene, even if it is very simple. He comes in and just absolutely throws a shit fit and is slashing things around. And this is kind of like a serious scene in parts. You know, his reaction to it should be, holy shit, she's gone. I really need her. She's vital. I really, really need this piece of the map. And then they do this weird comedic tonal turnaround where you see these stormtroopers kind of approaching and there are sparks and shit flying out of the room from his tantrum, and they kind of awkwardly look at each other and start walking the other way because they want to avoid his tantrum. And that's probably the funniest joke in the film, or like the hardest. I laughed, partly because it's straight up funny and partly because it's so strange tonally. I mean, the scene with Rey is actually quite funny, what she convinces the stormtrooper to do. I won't go into the joke there, but with Kylo, it's weird to have that as like a serious character becomes comic relief. It would make more sense if the setup for that was more comedic, and it is funny, and that is a funny idea of the kind of the minions just kind of wanting to avoid their master's like little temper tantrum. It's like tonally, it's very strange and very out of place. That kind of kept on going through my brain after I came out of the theater and I was coming home. Just how weird that was. On top of that, okay, Supreme Master Snoke. First of all, that is a fucking terrible name for an ultra villain, you know, like Palpatine, Sidious, Darth Sidious, the Emperor, like, you know, strong names. Snoke? No. I mean, obviously he's going to be revealed later on. I have a feeling that he's going to be Plagueis. From what I've briefly read, he sounds very, very similar to him. I'm not sure why they're not calling him Plagueis. I'm pretty sure the prequels canonically called him Plagueis. Other flaws in the film. Okay, so the whole thing in A New Hope, Alderaan gets destroyed, and the thing is that it's sad for the audience because Leia's homeworld is Alderaan. It serves the dual purpose of A, showing out what the Death Star can do, and B, having sympathy for Leia and hate for the Empire because they've just killed a bunch of innocent people, and we sympathize with that because we know Leia, that's Leia's home planet, and we sympathize with Leia because she's a good person. The issue with 5 planets being destroyed in The Force Awakens is not that, oh my god, more people died, so it's worse. It's that there's not an emotional connection to the planets. They try to make one very, very quickly where they show a bunch of people in a city looking up and there's a laser beam coming through the sky and they're all scared and oh my god, and you feel, you know, sympathy for those people. But the issue is that none of the main characters are from one of these planets, and it's meant to be like a republic, but we never really see the republic and we don't really get a complete gist of what the republic does. We didn't really need a full explanation, but it would have been nice to have a bit more information about what these planets actually did, how the republic was functioning, how the First Order actually came about. Like, and that's the issue, is you don't want to just go, okay, this is what happened in the last 30 years between these two films. The First Order came to power after this and the Republic was situated in Coruscant, and you don't want to do that, but at the same time, you do have to kind of like fill in the blanks a little bit. There's a great scene where one of the bounty hunters has Luke's lightsaber hidden in a chest randomly, and Rey kind of has a calling, and a really, really great hallucination scene after she touches it. But this bounty hunter gives Han Solo Luke's lightsaber after Rey rejects it and says, no, I don't want to touch that thing, I'm too scared of the hallucination. And Han goes, well, how did you get this? And he goes, it's a long story, but it doesn't matter. And that's true for the audience. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that she has it. And it's plausible enough that she has it, you know. She's like the lord of the bounty hunters, and she's 900 years old, and she's very wise. She's essentially like Yoda light, but yellow. I think most of my other main issues were with some of the characters, particularly Kylo Ren and Finn, felt like they weren't developed enough. And particularly Finn, I didn't feel like he really had much of an impact on the story. Like, that's not to say I don't like his character. I think it's good that you have a developed stormtrooper as, you know, more of a person, and you kind of get that like human characteristic side of them, someone who's kind of repulsed by what the Empire does. Because that's always something that's baffled me and has baffled many people in films, where you have an overlord ruler a la Darth Sidious, a la Plagueis, a la Snoke in this case, and why you'd have a bunch of, you know, people actually following these obviously completely evil, murderous people. And that's explained, A, because it's revealed that Finn's upbringing was as like a trained killer as a stormtrooper. The only thing I could think of was that he was in the sanitation department, and so he didn't really have as much of a military upbringing, but at the same time, he's very comedic and kind of lighthearted, so that doesn't really work together. But my main issue was that despite his character being really great, his acting was probably the best out of anyone's in the film, probably. But despite that being interesting, and despite his character kind of having good chemistry with other people, I don't really know what purpose he served in the film. He didn't really do anything. And, you know, I don't think you can really use the excuse, oh, okay, he's going to be important in later films with this. Like, you know, you can set up stuff for later films only if it works in one film. So I didn't really feel like he contributed much of importance, specifically when they're on the Death Star, the Starkiller base, whatever. I'm just going to call it the Death Star because it's essentially just the Death Star. It's the same thing. You're not tricking anyone. It's the same thing. And he doesn't really do much. You know, that doesn't bother me a lot, but that did confuse me. I was kind of waiting for him to do something. Though it is interesting, I do like the fact that he gets his shit completely kicked in by Kylo Ren. I thought that was actually a nice way to do that he didn't just totally, like, manage to completely defeat him out of nowhere, a bit like Rey did, which I'll go into a little bit later. That was probably my least favorite part of the film, her kind of going, oh, that's right, the Force exists, and defeating Kylo Ren. That's just... can't do that, sorry. The other thing was Kylo Ren's character. As I mentioned, I do like the idea of this kind of petulant character, very much like Zuko in the beginning of Avatar, who will probably become a much more Darth Vader-like character, possibly even adorn the Darth Vader costume. I tentatively want to call that will happen, and I'm not 100% convinced, but the Darth Vader image, the product, is so iconic that I feel like they're going to feel that they have to insert that in the film, and he might just put on the Darth Vader mask, etc. It's not that much of a change from his normal one, and that might be after his training is complete. I'm just calling that now, and that's when he'll kind of transition from this kind of petulant, kind of angry person who's confused into full-on bad person. And then I have a feeling that he's going to be recurring, and it's going to be poetry with the other three films, and I have a feeling that he's inevitably going to turn good in the end of the third film, the 9th Star Wars film, as Vader did, because, you know, they got to do poetry. I could be completely wrong about that, but considering that they copied A New Hope here, I have a very strong feeling, even though I don't want it to happen, I have a very, very strong feeling that they're going to copy Empire Strikes Back and then Return of the Jedi in the subsequent films, because they were effective, and that's what they've done this time. I mean, I really, really hope that they're able to expand and kind of create very much their own original story, much in the same way the prequels did, but not shit. And I really hope they do that, because they've got a lot of very, very, very good material to work with. They've got a great setting. They've got great practical special effects, technically amazing. They've got the writer of Empire Strikes Back even. The actual plot structure and script of this film is very tight. A lot of the dialogue feels a little bit meh, especially a lot of the, I'm talking about exposition. I'm doing exposition now because I have to introduce all these different things at once. And that's a bit clunky, but, you know, besides that, the actual plot of the film is very, very tight. Now, the main issue I have with the film that I actually totally forgot about at the beginning of this review, and the reason why the color changes in this is because my camera decided to start dying in the middle. As I was sorting that out, I started thinking, oh my god, what happened at the ending of this film? And I remembered the kind of semi-Deus Ex Machina that happened with Rey, where she's fighting Kylo Ren, and she's kind of getting whooped, or she's fighting him to a draw essentially, but he's kind of winning. He starts talking to her about how he can take her on as an apprentice because she's strong in the Force or something, and then she goes, the Force, that is a thing that exists, and then proceeds to completely beat him. That's not rating too highly for me. Yeah, there are several things wrong with that. For one, I feel like someone of Rey's experience wouldn't be able to defeat someone of Kylo Ren's experience. But to balance that out, to be fair, Kylo Ren was weakened. A, he got shot in the stomach. B, he got stabbed in the shoulder. And C, he just killed his dad, so that's some pretty heavy shit. And then D, Rey is really strong in the Force, but I don't feel like that's enough of a reason for her to be able to defeat. And that's the plot element of that. I don't feel like that was set up enough, or there was enough foreshadowing, or enough development of that. And then the secondary thing to that is the way in which they reveal it, of Rey just going, oh, that's right, the Force, it exists. I should use that to defeat Kylo Ren. It's really not very well written in. The ironic thing is that they've copied that element from A New Hope and a lot of films where a character will, you know, be training in something, but they won't 100% get it, or they will be, you know, just learning along the way, and then they suddenly come to a realization in the final moment, in the climax, and then they win. And that's essentially what happens in A New Hope, you know. Luke is doing the trench run in the Death Star. He hears the words of Obi-Wan Kenobi, his wise mentor, and then he's able to blow up the Death Star with the help of the Force. And, you know, he trained before in the Force, he trained before in the lightsaber, and then he does that, and it's like, Good, awesome. But with this, it's like Rey 5 minutes before, or like 10 minutes before this happened, she kind of basically discovers how to use the Force and kind of had it explained to her. And then suddenly she's kind of able to go, oh yes, I'm going to use the Force to be a master in the lightsaber, even though she'd never picked it up before. So I feel like if they wanted to do that, they shouldn't have done it in such a contrived manner where she goes, the Force. And I really was... That let me down a bit. I was a bit disappointed in that specific choice of words and that specific choice of shot. I do love the lighting in that scene, even though it is very much reminiscent of the Vader-Luke fight scene in Empire Strikes Back with the kind of blue-red lighting on their faces, though that's fine. You know, you're going to get that with lightsabers, you're going to get that. I do like the actual setting of it. I think it's a kind of clever way to combine we're going to have a fight outside in a nice setting with we're blowing up the Death Star at the same time. It's a nice way to tie those together. Not really fully satisfied with that explanation they gave for Rey being able to beat Kylo Ren, who's been trained for a while. That's my main disappointment with the film, that it's kind of anticlimactic in that sense that she's suddenly able to defeat him. And somehow no one ever gets lethal wounds from the lightsaber, even though it's like one of the most dangerous things ever. You know, like Finn gets a massive cut up his back, but Kylo Ren could have easily just impaled him very, very easily, or just kind of cut mildly deeper and destroyed all of his organs. You know, I'm not a huge nitpicker, and I feel like nitpicking this film is stupid. There are better films to nitpick. There are better films that are very, very plot-based that you should nitpick. But this is not a film you really need to nitpick. Like, I mean, a good example of films you don't need to nitpick are the original Star Wars films. Yes, they all have plot holes, they have some bad dialogue, they have some bad acting moments, they have some cringy, corny stuff. Overall, they're very, very solid pieces, and they're more about the mythos of the world and the setting and the characters. And I'm not just saying that to go, nah, it doesn't matter about, plot details, that's just, because it's Star Wars, it doesn't matter. No, for this particular type of story, you don't have to have such a focus on that. If the film had extremely bland characters, and it was very much, we have to go here, we have to destroy the Death Star, we have to do this, and it was very, very, very plot-based, and it was all about the plot and all about that, then yes, it would be very reasonable to be annoyed at minor issues that didn't make sense. With this, it's more about how the characters interact with the world, how the characters learn, how the characters react to other characters, and how they learn from things in their environment. Obviously, that scene at the end being disappointing is bad enough for me to actually be annoyed by it, and for that to detract from the film, however small, but to detract from the film for me. It's not something that I would cite as like a major reason for not thinking that this was, the best thing since sliced bread. So with those flaws in mind, I'm giving this an 81. Actually, I was very, very pleased with this, surprisingly so, and it's wonderful that it was actually decent. And it should be noted that 81 is a score that I rank above Return of the Jedi. I think overall, Return of the Jedi has some moments and some scenes that are brilliant and some of the best in the original trilogy, and it's classic in that regard. Overall, as a film, it's quite a bit weaker. Obviously, The Force Awakens is a significant step down from Empire Strikes Back. Empire Strikes Back is a near-perfect film of its sort. Not a near-perfect film, but a near-perfect film of what it's trying to achieve. A New Hope is getting there and is a very, very solid film and definitely above The Force Awakens, but Jedi has enough flaws that I think personally that they sink it beneath The Force Awakens just a tiny bit overall. And obviously all four are far, far above the prequels by unimaginable amounts. So, I was going into this expecting it to be 60, roughly 60, and that's not to say that my judgment would be influenced by that and I just go, oh, it should be closer to 60 than, 100, but I was just expecting that. And I'm very, very glad that it wasn't bad. Unbelievably glad that it wasn't bad or even average. I think the worst thing for this to have been was for it to be average, and I think that's really the case for a lot of films, books, plays, etc. Anything. Is it just to be meh? The prequels were so bad that you could just immediately disregard essentially everything in them. But, if The Force Awakens had all these amazing practical effects, all these amazing CGI effects, and it had the writer of Empire Strikes Back and a competent director, and then it was just kind of like, that would have really been pretty painful to view and to discuss. Luckily, that isn't the case. This is an extremely tight film, really, and I'm pretty pleased with it. I'm really hoping that Episode 8 is not a carbon copy of Empire Strikes Back. I have a very strong feeling, though, that it will copy many elements from it, and even if it does that, hopefully it does it in the same way that they've copied A New Hope here, but hopefully they distance themselves more. This film is good enough, even with the references to A New Hope, though I feel like that will be the strongest criticism people will give it as a film, next to nitpicking it, and I feel like nitpicking is not really necessary for this film. In some regards it is, but not completely necessary really at all.
All I do is that your future is reality.